Hi, my name is Martin Andersson. I'm from the University of Gothenburg, and me together with Rich Leggett, Keith Eckerman, Anja Halmér and Sarah Mattsson has been involved in a project we call IDAC Bio, an internal dosimetry software for retrospective exposure based on the new ICRP biogenetic models and specific absorbed fraction data. So the ICRP are currently revising their dose coefficients for occupational intake in the OIR series and to members of the general public. And for the occupational, they have published 4 parts of 5, which covers the most relevant elements. And for members of the general public, ICRP will publish the revision in a couple of years. And the aim of this project is to create a tool which can calculate continuous or acute intake with arbitrary integration time for commitment effective dose based on the ICRP computational framework for internal dose assessments. And this will provide the possibility to perform retrospective dose estimations where you take data sets from a series of measurements and you fit the time activity curves of the data points. So the aim is to create a tool which can be applied to other exposure scenarios covered by the ICRP. So the ICRP computational framework for internal dose assessments bases on the revision of anatomical and physiological data, which are for use in radiological protection given in ICRP 89, where we define the reference persons, which effective dose is calculated to. ICRP came out with new decay data for dosimetry calculations for relevant elements and radioisotopes, which includes alpha, beta decays and photons. And ICRP also came out with both adult and pediatric computational reference phantoms, and the adults are shown here to the right. ICRP have for the adult come out with Monte Carlo simulated specific absorbed fraction for alpha, betas, photons, and in some case neutrons. And all of this combined with the biogenetic models, ICRP have combined a computational framework for internal dose assessment. And ICRP will publish this for acute intake, but there are many different types of intake or exposure workers or members of the public can be exposed to. So this graph shows it first the case which ICRP covers, but otherwise could be a continuous intake over a limit time or a protracted intake over a working life. And all this can at one time result in the same activity. So we try to make a code which covers all this. So we put a graphical interface on it, so you can first select, now you can only select occupational, hopefully in the future you can also include the general public. You can select if you want to have biogenetic values from male or female in the hat models and the masses. You can select from 95 elements and 1252 radioisotopes. In this case I selected strontium-90. And then you have a possibility to choose if you want to make for injection, ingestion, or inhalation. And for inhalation, you can choose particle size and things. You can also select, instead of only acute, you can select continuous all the time. You can make up a time span for this continuous intake. You can say that every day, 8 hours a day exposure. Or you can have exposure 5 out of 7 days, 8 hours a day, once a week, once a month. And then which will be exposed until a certain determined period, and then you will calculate this integration times, where you start here is from 20 to 70, so it's 50 years, which is the one ICRP do. So ICRP gives committed effective dose for integration period of 50 years. But if you, for any reason, wants to do shorter or 100 years or something, you can choose this yourself. So in this case, I choose strontium 90 oral diet for strontium tetane. When you do afterwards, you press calculate, and the code does the calculations. And in this case, here comes the results. It shows in graphical the absorbed doses for the target organs for both male and female. You can choose if you want to show the complete absorbed dose, or you can show the different radiation types. So you can have only for alpha dose, electron, and photon dose. And you can also select if you want to do the contribution from one specific progeny. So in this case, you have strontium 90 and yttrium 90. So you can separate and see the dose contribution from each of them, or the total absorbed dose. And in this case, so it will have first a strontium 90 biogenetic model, and then it will use as yttrium 90 biogenetic models. You can also, if you want to calculate effective dose, you will have the effective dose as defined in 103. You could change the radiation tissue weighting factor used for the effective dose if that's of interest. And you will possibly have the opportunity to take the absorbed doses and combine these to other types of risk factors or indicators of risk from the radiation. And you can press save, and you will gather all in a PDF. So you will have it in more comprehensive way, so you can store all calculations. So we validated the code against the published occupational values published in ICRP 134, 137, and 141. And we did this for inhalation, injection, and ingestion of acute intake for 50 years. We also tested the code on continuous intake. So we chose gadolinium 148. The reason why we choose this one is because it's a pure alpha emitting, but it also has a long half-life. So its half-life is 75 years, which means that the integration period will only be 2/3 of the first half-life. And this will, so integration period you select will affect the effective dose you do, because it will have a long half-life. The thing is also with gadolinium is that it has really low fraction uptake value. It's 0.005 from the stomach to the blood. So almost all gadolinium follows the alimentary tract, and only a small fraction goes into the blood. Also another reason is that for spallation source, when we use tungsten as a target, this will be a product. So for accidental release, it could be a significant radiological impact in terms of internal dose to exposure to human in case of high level of acute or lower level of continuous levels. So we tested the code for the continuous intake. So we put a gadolinium for continuous intake of 1 becquerel per day during 10 days, but we integrate for 50 years. And here you see the activity curves. So the activity in the GI tract, as it's not so much is transfer from the ingestion to the blood. Most will be in the GI tract and just be excreted, but some of this part will be get up and uptake in the bone, and due to the long half-life, this will stay here and it will decay in the bone during the entire integration time. So as you see here, you have both the GI tract, the bone, and the whole body activity. And after 10 years, when the continuous intake stops, you see that the GI tract just pass retention out. But we also change it to 30 years, and you see here that you will have a longer build-up factor, but the GI tract will be continuous as it is a continuous intake, and once it stops, it goes through. and we also did it for 50 years. So it shows that you can simulate continuous uptake, and you can have a predetermined integration period. And if you look at the effective dose from these cases, you see that for 10-year exposure of 1 becquerel per day of gadolinium will result in 69 microsievert. If you do it for 30 years, it will become 190 microsievert, and for 50 years it will be 260. However, also in Sweden, the dose restriction for members of the public from any type of exposure is 0.1 millisievert. So if you convert this to this annual restriction of 0.1 millisievert per year, you can calculate what's the limit of intake in ingestion per day. So for 10 years it will be 14 becquerels per day is the limit. For 30 years of intake it will be 16 becquerel, and for 50 it will be 19 becquerel. So this is a way how you can show how you can use continuous uptake, and you can also change and modify the uptake scenarios if that's suitable. Another way also is that if you have a series of measurements and you don't know the exact exposure scenario, you could use the data point which you have measured. Here is from cobalt-60 from a power plant worker who has been monitored during 18 years. And during this time we have measured the lung activity. So what we did was that we fitted the lung activity of cobalt-60. So from this data point we saw that it was probably an inhalation of type S, which is for cobalt oxide. We saw that the lung activity, so we put out the biogenetics curves for the lung regions and sum this up, and then we fitted this lung activity to the data points, and we changed it both in activity, initial activity, but also where on the slope this data point fits best. So we found out that for this, using this data point, the best estimate would be of an acute intake 2 years before of 350 kilobecquerel. As you see here in this fit, is also that we don't have any more data point before 0, and the fit assumes a high activity before this. So it could, if we had more data points before this, we could see if there is other solutions also possible. But looking at this and the data points, where it fits best on this curve, we get these results, and it also gives an effective dose of 10 millisievert. So this is a way to show that how you can use activity curves generated from this new ISDRP revision of dose coefficients, and you can use that of series of data. And we also then, when we know the estimated intake, we then calculate the absorbed dose in the same way as shown here. So as a conclusion, the ISRP are receiving the internal dose coefficient for acute intake. This study extends the dose estimations to arbitrary exposure scenarios, continuous working days exposure, etc. Therefore, this software tool with a graphical interface being developed, which hope to facilitate arbitrary and effective dose calculations based on the ISRP computational framework for internal dose assessments. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.